Hashtag Team Laura. I'm just kidding. I'm pretty ambivalent about this love triangle. Drew here, and I have to say, I feel like this episode of American Gods, Conscience of the King, I think it would have actually been a better episode to release last week for Valentine's Day, because quite a bit of this episode had to do with love and relationships, and in a large part the end of a relationship. The relationship between Demeter and Odin took center stage for a great part of this episode, and I actually found a lot of this very moving. I think that Ian McShane and Blythe Danner did a lot with their acting just to make you feel this history between these characters and the love that they used to share. And this episode showed us that this relationship kind of came to an end in the past after the death of their son. And Odin had the opportunity to stick it out and ended up leaving her, and Tyr ended up being the one to comfort her during this time of hardship for her. And a lot of relationships in real life end after the death of a child. I think it's a challenging thing. So the interesting aspect of this episode was watching both characters struggling with their feelings for each other. I think that for Demeter, it was struggling to understand whether Odin actually loved her or whether he was the same person that he used to be and he really only still cares about the amassment of power for himself. And I think that Odin's struggle was similar in that he was trying to decide about his feelings for Demeter and whether or not he could, put aside his desire to have this war that will bring him glory and help to bring the old gods back into their place of prominence, or whether he could have happiness in a relationship with her. And watching them go through this episode, I thought that there were scenes where they showed a lot of interesting chemistry. The scene where she was knocking the pots off of the garden table so as to blame Odin and get him thrown in some kind of confinement so that she didn't have to spend her night with him. And I thought that there was also just this palpable tenderness and longing with these two characters, particularly in the scene where everything came to a head when Odin was talking to Demeter through the door. And there was a moment there where you felt that perhaps she was going to let down her guard and enter into a relationship with again. And it's this moment where she brings up the fact that they never mourned their son together. And there's a moment where at that point you think that Odin perhaps is going to respond and that they're going to end up together, but instead he ends up, reiterating his desire to bring the old gods back into their prominence. And Demeter realizes that whatever love he may have for her, his desire to amass power to himself is always going to overshadow that. And that plays into her final decision at the end of this episode to leave the nursing home, but not to re-enter the world, but to leave her corporeal form behind and just cease to exist in America in this physical existence. And the way that this scene played out with Odin watching from the window as that very, very moving music played in the background, I felt that the look that Demeter gave Odin before she vanished off into the sky, it was a mixture of resignation and defiance almost, I would have said. That was very moving, and I thought Blythe Danner did a lot with this role that is obviously in some ways a character that's not going to have a huge impact on the show going forward, seemingly. We'll see, but it seems like that was it. It was also interesting as Odin re-examined his relationship with Demeter and how he and Tyr had both been present in her life. There was this moment of self-realization as he was putting on the play for the residents of the mental health facility. And there's this moment, I think, of self-realization where he realized how his selfishness had affected her and Tyr. And I kind of expected this episode to end with her ending up with Tyr. I feel like Dennis O'Hare deserves credit as well, because I think he does a lot with an underwritten character. But that moment where he puts his hand on her shoulder during this play, I felt like the face that he made, the longing on his face as he looked at her, really did a lot to sell the dynamic between these characters. And you see in Tyr someone similar to Odin. He's also a god of war, but someone who's willing to put his past behind and willing to accept a more humble existence, similar to Demeter. So I kind of felt like maybe they belonged together, but no, it seems like she only had romantic feelings for Odin, and the realization that he was never going to be able to put aside his desire for glory and just be willing to enjoy a humbler existence with her. That realization led her to decide that she no longer wished to exist on the human plane in America. There is actually an odd similarity between the way that this plot line broke down and the way that the relationship between Mr. World and Technical Boy developed this episode. Obviously, I'm really appreciating the way that they're giving Technical Boy a little bit more dimension, allowing him to struggle with the fact that he's suddenly experiencing emotions because of what Bilquis did to him and what that is doing to him internally. In this episode, I feel like there was not really a rationale for the decision to have Danny Trejo take over as Mr. World. I feel that it felt like a more natural fit for this character in some ways than Miss World did, but at least there was more of a rationale for why Crispin Glover's character would transform into Miss World. But this, to me, felt like there was not really any justification. It was just like, oh, we've got to have another character fill in. And it's interesting to me how all the characters seem to just realize that it's Mr. World, despite the fact that they, just entered the room and he really looks nothing like the original Mr. World. But all these characters seem to recognize it. Even Laura and Salim at the end of the episode seem to know who they're talking to. But in this scene, you see a similar aspect to the relationship between Demeter and Odin, in that you see Technical Boy longing to feel affection, longing to feel that Mr. World cares about him. And Mr. World, comes out and says exactly what Technical Boy wants to hear. He basically tells him, yes, I do love you. You're my favorite of all the new gods. But then his actions show that he's ultimately more interested in the war between the new gods and the old, and in amassing power for himself, than in Technical Boy and what he's going through. And Technical Boy ends up fleeing. And it's going to be interesting to see what happens with Technical Boy. I feel like he should still stay a somewhat villainous character, but it'll be interesting to see how they develop the progression of his character arc. In Lakeside, which we've kind of not spent that much time in this season, we have a love triangle going on, as I kind of alluded to in the opening of this review. I personally would advise you to not root for either Marguerite or Laura, but I will say I do find it, just kind of an entertaining enough addition to the show to have this love triangle. The moment when Marguerite came in and Shadow said, "My late wife," that gave me a good chuckle. And I feel, of course, that it's going to be interesting to see how this breaks down with Shadow realizing that Odin is his father and Laura wanting to kill him, how this is going to play out in their relationship going forward. I think, there were some interesting revelations this episode about Marguerite. We discover that she is somehow the sister of Samantha Blackcrow. And we also learn that something I feel that Shadow should have picked up on a lot quicker if he was paying attention, that her son, who is missing, likely suffered the same fate as the missing girl at the beginning of this season, that even though he supposedly went off to Florida to be with his father, the lack of communication with Marguerite and Sam seems to indicate that he probably never made it there and possibly suffered whatever fate the other missing children in this town have suffered. At the end of this episode, we also discover that it's Derek, Marguerite's son, who has been stealing women's underwear, apparently, and chopping holes in them. Obviously, I think even if you haven't read the books, you probably suspect that this is a red herring, but it's one of those things that's a cliffhanger to draw people back into the story next episode. So we'll see what the explanation for this is. I feel that even though Lakeside was the part of this story I was a little bit trepidatious about, I feel like they've kind of substituted Shadow's relationship with Marguerite for his relationship with Lakeside. It's not that she wasn't in the book, it's just that I think in the book it was more about him experiencing small town American life, and we really haven't gotten to see a lot of that this season, mainly because he keeps getting called away on errands for Mr. Wednesday. So I kind of feel the lack of this quite strongly, and I hope that they will take the time to give Lakeside a little bit more texture by the end of the season. They've done a bit, but I just think they could do more. Lastly, at the end of this episode, near the end anyway, we have Mr. World offering to ally with Laura and Salim as she seeks to kill Mr. Wednesday. So it'll be interesting to see if this is an alliance that she's open to, and if Mr. World potentially has some ulterior motives. Again, no spoilers for people that haven't read the book. So those are my thoughts on this episode of American Gods. If you're interested in seeing my upcoming reviews of other shows, please consider subscribing. As always, let me know what you thought in the comments, and thanks for watching.